Out. Good evening and welcome to Petaluma. Let's try this one more time. Good evening and welcome to Know Before You Grow, a committee of Petaluma chat. I'm Dan Like, and as always, thanks to Sharon Kirk and Dave Alden who do the heavy lifting and all the others who help us out. Tonight's discussion is about Planning 101. But before we get to that, a few notes. First, you may notice I'm a little frazzled. I just had some last minute logistics stuff and I had to run around, and so my adrenaline's up. All deal. Second, not only that, but we've already been Zoom bombed this evening. As soon as I fired this up, apparently they troll Twitter because Zoom sent me an email warning about it. So if the screen goes weird, if we start getting swastikas drawn on things, if you hear obscene music, I'll kick the appropriate people as quickly as I can. If your screen goes blank, bear with me. I'll be there shortly.
You want your picture on?
Not yet.
Oh, and let me
The corner of your box.
everybody
And then
hang
start
on
video.
Okay.
and mute.
Okay.
If everybody would let me mute all here. And part of this is all of the stuff that I normally do on the way in. I didn't get a chance to do again yet. So apologies. My role will be primarily to sit in the background and mute people when they flush the toilet or do other things. And there we go. Usual note about the Brown Act in public meetings. We have to be, people who hold elected or appointed office need to be a little careful about participating in serial meetings. And if you want more detail on that, talk to one of them or talk to me later. If you are one of them, be aware of that. Finally, we have forums on transit-oriented development on September 22nd and on vehicle miles traveled and land use policy on October 13th. Both of those are coming up. And on September 23rd at noon at Aquas Cafe, we'll have the usual casual discussion. With that, we have a note on translation. You want to pipe in now?
I can share my screen too. We have a slide about it.
Okay, go for it. I'll get.
Okay. Dan, should I just do my little intro and then we'll get to the next slide?
Go for it.
Great.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. All the little boxes are mine. Okay, well, everybody, I just want to echo Dan's welcome. Thank you so much for being here this evening. I'm Christina Paul. I am a principal planner with the city and also the general plan project manager. Well, that's one of my duties. Apologies, I do know how to work PowerPoint usually. And I want to say that our session tonight is all about Planning 101. We have a subtitle that we'll get to in just a moment. Again, I'm the principal policy planner on this project. We also have our interim community development director with us, Heather Hines, who is very welcome to add her 15 cents whenever she feels thus inclined. And then we also have David Hernandez Garcia with us, who is a new policy planner with the city, and we're very excited to have him join and present part of the material today. Martin is going to be helping us with translation, Martin Rivarola. And so on the next slide, he is going to explain how to listen to this in Spanish. Please, Martin, go ahead.
Thank you, Cristina. Hola, muy buenas noches a todos y a todas. Mi nombre es Martín Rivarola. Voy a estar haciendo la traducción simultánea al español de este evento en la noche de hoy. Para usted acceder al audio en español, todo lo que debe hacer es, así como lo indica la pantalla, apretar donde dice Interpretation, que tiene el globo terráqueo. Esto le dará la opción de inglés o español. Usted elige español y a partir de ahí el canal de audio que usted estará escuchando será con mi voz, ¿sí? Con esto espero que usted pueda participar de esta reunión plenamente. Muchas gracias. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you, Martin. And I really want to appreciate the Know Before You Grow folks who are hosting us tonight. It is difficult for us to find open spots on the city's public meeting slots. So we appreciate this partnership. And we also appreciate you guys facilitating the translation this evening. I will be trying to count to 5 after all of my slides so that Martin can finish, because he has to listen to what I say and then say it again in Spanish. And so I'm going to try to not just keep going. Okay, so I'm going to get going with the presentation. You should already have audio by now, otherwise we should likely have heard from you. Please do remain muted. Like I can see people's boxes and I'm hearing a little bit of an echo. So if you can please remain muted while you are not speaking, that would be much appreciated so everybody can hear really well. And you have the option of having your video on or off. And let us know in the chat if you have any particular questions. I cannot look at the chat while I'm presenting, so I will rely on other folks to do that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Dan specifically. Okay. So we were putting this presentation together and chatting with Sharon about what we wanted to share. And we came to the conclusion that what we're trying to do is deliver a master's degree in city planning in 35 minutes. So if there's a lot of material here, we recognize that. And we are very open to your questions. And I do want to frame all of this by saying that one of our questions back to you is, what would you like to hear more about? Know Before You Grow might plan additional sessions around those topics. And then we can also share that information through our general plan channels. Our objectives for this evening, and I want to thank David, who is our resident education expert for this, for having objectives, is firstly to identify how the general plan process will shape Petaluma and how residents, community members can shape the process and the outcomes. Ideally, by the end of this, you will have a feeling for what the general plan is and how that relates to zoning and specific plans, other kinds of plans. How do these plans, these planning tools provide frameworks for implementation? How do we get from a general plan to a bike lane, for example? How do we address different issues using our different planning, our planning tools? Again, we are working on the general plan, but we have a lot of other tools at our disposal. And then we will think about the constraints and opportunities for the general plan in Petaluma context. These are the topics that we will be going through this evening. We will be doing an overview of planning tools in general, essential information about the general plan, which is like an umbrella for many of our other plans, and then how all of this fits in with CEQA, or the California Environmental Quality Act. Then some tools that you will likely have heard of, including zoning, specific plans, master plans, again, implementation, how do we get that bike lane on the ground, and then a little bit of an update about the general plan, because we're really excited about that process. Okay, so I am going to turn it over to David, and he's going to take us through the next few slides.
Excellent. Thank you, Christina, and thank you, Know Before You Grow, and everyone who we've been working with throughout this process. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all, and really to dig into something that Christina, I, and Heather, and many of you are very passionate about, which is planning, and be able to share some of the big insights on why this is so important. So starting off with this basic question of why plan and why go through a general plan process. So one thing that really guides us in our approach is that this is an opportunity for the city to have a community conversation about the future. It's not simply, as much as it is a requirement, it really is about this moment that cities intentionally take to decide what their future is going to be. So for us, that's been really the guiding principle in all of our kind of larger framework and all the work that we've been doing. And as we can see with you all as well. So in terms of being proactive about addressing these critical issues, as you all know, we've already been working since last year, and these are some issues that we've heard from you, from the community. What are priorities? So sustainability, housing, infrastructure and utilities, resilience and safety, infill development, parks and open space, carbon neutrality, the Petaluma River, economic development, equity and health, active transportation, historic preservation. So each of these priorities is immense. So this is what we're holding within the general plan. It's a way for us to move forward with this and to really kind of lay the framework, methods and tools to implement this vision for the future, and also be legally compliant with the state's requirements that we'll go over in just a moment. So working with Sharon, we talked a lot about, just the, in planning, we say a lot, the alphabet soup of planning, or kind of just this mix of planning jargon, which even for people who study this and people who work in this can always be a little bit confusing. And to think of how these different plans relate to one another. So this graphic, as simple as it can be, really hopes to kind of lay out how these different plans relate to each other. So to describe it, we have the general plan, which is kind of like the big umbrella, this big overview, and it's made up of specific elements that we'll get into during our presentation. Then we have sub-area plans, the zoning code, functional and topic plans. And each of these are really, whether it's based on geography, in the sub-area plan, or the zoning code and what our land use and what we're able to do on different plots of land. And then finally, the functional or topic plans, which really move forward issues or specific types of planning, like bike and ped master plans. These are made up of further, more specific plans, area plans, zoning, regulations, bike and ped master plans, climate action, and adaptation plans, and the the parks and rec master plan. So all of these are, again, right now we're throwing it all at you, but really what we want you to understand is this relationship. How do these move towards implementation? And to think about that, we're kind of prompting you to think of the different actors that are involved in this. So thinking about, from a city role of implementation, this is city council. This is city council actions, committees, commissions, and boards. And I know some of you all are a part of those. City budgets, how much money is available for different priorities, and work plans, and the staff that's hired on by the city to carry this work forward, and then resolutions, ordinances, and declarations, also regulations, policies in the municipal code, and of course, engagement with residents. This doesn't just happen kind of devoid of people. So this really leads us to think of how the community and the private sector also plays a role in this. So thinking about engagement in the process and political pressure, participation in city-led initiatives, also community organizing. And this, as we know, can be kind of with the city or outside of the city. And then thinking about how people actually react to these policies and regulations. Do people use these services? Do people use the bike lane? Do people follow these recommendations, or do they simply ignore them? And again, we're, as much as the city wants to, control private property, it's also about thinking about how people are compliant. So again, some key takeaways from this big chart is thinking that the general plan creates the larger vision and policy landscape. Sub-area plans, zoning code, and functional and topic plans build out specific elements of the general plan based on geography, land uses, and specific issues. And all of these plans and actions should be aligned to the general plan but it is up to citizens and city leaders to follow the visions and policies directions set forth in the general plan. So that's what we want you to take away with from all those charts and buckets. So that leads us to the general plan's essentials. What is the purpose? It's like a constitution for the city. You all might have seen this graphic at some of our area meetings, but it's really a process that kind of takes many different actors. So thinking about the legal basis for land use decisions and how that's a big part of the plan. Think about how it's a long-term policy that guides a city's future actions and can be anywhere from 25 to 30 years, but it really varies, as we'll talk about in a moment. It also really seeks to preserve and enhance a community's strength, different strengths, and addresses topics of concern and enables the community to come together to develop a shared vision for the future.
And I want to just add, David, I added one of the bullet points while you weren't watching, which is that one of the ways to think about the general plan is like it's a constitution for the city. And so it gives us an overarching policy framework. But as you know about the Constitution of the United States, there's some room for interpretation and a lot of room for implementation that follows this overarching document.
Thanks, Christina. Great. So again, we've been talking about how this is a requirement, and some of the required elements of a general plan of this bigger requirement are how we use land. That we'll keep using this term land use, which is basically how we use or which uses we allow on different plots of land, conservation, noise, environmental justice, circulation, open space, safety, and housing. So all of these need to be our required elements, and there's some additional elements that you can throw in there. So thinking about, again, there's no required planning period. This can take as long as, and be in the scope of time that a city and a community decides. So for example, Sacramento every 5 years, Pacifica does 20-year spans. And there's more or less an average of 15 to 20. And planning periods are estimated based on what the plan itself is proposing. So the city leaders and citizens are also playing a role in that process. And this varies. Yes.
So that means that our Petaluma 2025 plan isn't going to expire in 2025, and we can decide when to update it.
Mm-hmm. And this next point of plan consistency. So we got into some deep discussions of planning when talking about this with Sharon. But it's really this idea that that no policy conflicts, either textual or diagrammatic, can exist between different components of the plan, which is, we can go into that, very jargony text to say it all needs to fall under this umbrella and be consistent with the general plan. So all of those other layers of sub-area plans, of the zoning code, of functional and topic plans need to be in compliance with the general plan. And moving on to the role of the general plan, what it should do and what it should not do. So again, setting land uses and development patterns, identifying the long-term direction of growth and priorities, benefits, or goals and policies, as well as setting metrics and targets, and setting the stage for implementation through other plans, and also working with Sequa. So what does it not do? It doesn't solve every issue facing the city. It's not overly specific so as to prevent city leaders from taking a different route or adapting to the moment and different changes that arise that were unplanned. And it also isn't everything to everyone. So it needs, but at the same time, it can't be so general and vague that it doesn't do anything. It just says, oh, we'll have a beautiful city in 20 years. So just like Christina was saying, our 2025 plan doesn't expire. So this was adopted in 2008, and it took us, 7 years to develop it, so it was quite extensive. And if we think about the context in which it's developed, it was the Great Recession. There was no smart service in the city. There was maybe, and when we're thinking about now, thinking about how we have an increased climate emergency, how we have a housing crisis. So thinking about all of these different changes that in a way we can plan for, but to what degree?
Right, and so this is highlighting some of the issues that we wanted to begin to respond to that the past general plan didn't.
And then here, just to highlight the elements that were part of that, I think we can kind of just glances these as some essentials being land use and all those ones that we described earlier as being essential. But
yeah,
also
and what's interesting here is that we actually in our current general plan have a lot of extra elements or optional elements. And so that's something that we're going to be looking at in the general plan update is which of these do we want to carry forward or combine or address differently?
Yes, for example, recreation and the arts. So with that, I think I'll hand it back to Christina to talk about how we're going to balance these all in our general plan update that we're embarking on right now.
Yeah, so one of the reasons the city wanted to do this general plan is to really enable us to have a comprehensive look at the web or all the interconnections of all of these issues. We are required to a housing element, which we're going to get into in less than a minute. But we just want to make sure that we're addressing this system as a whole rather than trying to pluck particular issues out and address them one at a time. When we think about the planning that we do planning within the Petaluma city limits. We also have a sphere of influence, which is the same as our urban growth boundary, which is like you can see over here around Petaluma Boulevard North, a little bit outside of the city limits in some areas, and then in some areas like over here by the golf course, it's the same boundary. And the county is responsible for the lands outside of these areas. And we need to, if we wanted to govern any of these lands, we would need to annex them. So I'm going to go through now each of the general plan elements that David outlined, some in more detail than others. First, we have the land use element, and this is one of the elements in which the general plan has the most teeth in that it sets, and I'm looking at Martine and trying not to talk too fast. It sets legal land uses for all of the land, all of the dirt, all of the water in the city limits. And it defines the allowable type of development. Can you have a shop? Can you have a house? Where do the parks go? That kind of thing, as well as relative intensity. So if you glance at this map, this light yellow color is single family housing. That's a house standing by itself. And then a lot of these brown areas are the same kind of thing. And then if we get our more intense colors like this darker yellow, that's where we see denser development, more apartment buildings, that kind of thing. You can see a code for that over here. This is actually a zoning map, not a general plan land use map, but we'll talk about how the general plan land use map goes over and becomes zoning. Okay. The housing element is another very significant part of the general plan. Unlike many of the other elements of the general plan, we are required by the state to update the housing element every 8 years. Some of you know this already. And part of this process is that we are required to plan for an assignment of housing development, particularly housing development at different levels of affordability. So that's something that we're required to do. It's a very different process this time around, and it's one of the triggers for wanting to do this general plan process in a holistic way. And I will go through this somewhat briefly, as some of you have seen this before, or some of this content before. But for this housing element cycle, there have been really a lot of new housing bills. I am not going to read this to you, but suffice it to say, there have been a lot of new bills that relate to housing, building jobs, veterans, and this is something that the city needs to consider. And it's actually significantly changed our work for the housing element. And here's a list of a few of the things that are different for us this time around. We really have to be much more practical when we are looking at the housing element to ensure that the sites that we identify for potential housing, which is something that we have to do, are feasible for development and equitably distributed throughout the city. That they've really sort of tightened the process on that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Still trying to wait for Martine to finish. So with this housing element, we have a current draft RENA allocation or assignment for the number of units that we think that we will need to plan for. This is being confirmed by our regional planning agency, ABAG, or the Association of Bay Area Governments. Right now, our draft RENA allocation is that we will need to plan for 1,910 housing units in these different levels of affordability, as well as actually some buffer units, so that if some of these don't get developed as affordable units, we still have the capacity as a city to accommodate these affordable units. If anybody has any questions about that, we will be happy to answer them later. But the impacts of this work, or that we need to do around the housing element, is that we are anticipating some fairly significant land use changes, likely zoning changes, and then we need to think about how those proposed housing units might impact the surrounding uses. So this is, as I mentioned, one of the reasons for wanting to do the general plan comprehensively. Another element of the general plan is the circulation element. Petaluma's current general plan is pretty progressive in this area, and we're not going to be throwing away all of the good work in that plan. We're going to be building off of it. The current plan sets a vision for a balanced multimodal network, and that's really what we're expecting to continue to work towards as part of this circulation element. We also are looking at safety element, which looks at seismic hazards, earthquakes, wildfires, flooding, hazardous material. How do we work on keeping people safe as a city? We also have a new environmental justice element that we will be developing. This is part of the new state guidelines for general plans that came out in 2017. And really what the environmental justice element is about how does the physical form of the city influence your health, your likelihood of thriving, your likelihood of achieving success, and however you define that. And so we're going to think about, how do we create a healthy city? How do we ensure equitable access to resources? And part of this is identifying particular areas in the city that are disadvantaged, either because of lack of access to particular resources, because of increased pollution burdens, and so on. And then we'll work on how do we mitigate those impacts for those particular geographic areas. We have some other additional elements that are required. These include conservation, open space, and noise. So we'll be looking at preservation of natural resources, at parks and rec facilities, and at mitigating noise impacts from, it could be the freeway or the airport or traffic or sporting facilities, or speedway, for example. These are things that we could be thinking about as part of the general plan. As I mentioned earlier, the current general plan has some optional elements in it, and the Office of Planning and Research, that's OPR, who puts out the guidelines for how to develop a general plan, has given us some guidelines for creating elements or parts of elements. These could be integrated into other elements. We again have some flexibility around that, around equitable and resilient communities and healthy communities. And these are all all considerations that we will be looking at as part of this general planning process. We'll also look at economic development. We have one of those elements already and are planning to have another one, and then climate change. So we may have a climate change element, it may be integrated throughout, and we're also going to be developing climate change specific policy. Another umbrella set of policies is CEQA. And so CEQA stands for the California Environmental Quality Act. This is a law from 1970. It's similar to NEPA, which is the national sort of environmental policy governing document that has a bit more teeth in California. The goal of CEQA is to ensure that folks are informed about potential environmental impacts of any kind of physical project, and to disclose why particular development decisions are being made. CEQA is, you can think about it as being required whenever there is a policy or a new policy or a policy change that could result in a direct impact to the environment. If we anticipate that that could be the case, then we need to go through each of these potential CEQA chapters or areas of consideration and think about the impacts in each of those. In some cases, we don't, we can say that there won't be an impact for one or more of these factors, but we need to at least consider them whenever we're undertaking a major project. That includes the general plan and the housing element, because those govern land use, which is the development of land, the use of the river and that kind of thing. For these particular projects, we will be doing a detailed review of housing element sites to ensure that those are as feasible for development as possible. And then we're going to be doing a full EIR for the general plan as well. So that work is part of this planning work that we're doing.
Excellent. So moving on. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Moving on to what is zoning, thinking about, we've been talking about how the general plan sets up established land uses, and then zoning really kind of digs into that even deeper. So just to go back to why zone, why do we have these different designations? The origins of zoning really lie in this idea of separating uses. So thinking about how we have housing here, but we keep our factories and industrial uses in different parts of the city. As we also know, zoning has been used to exclude and divide communities in different ways. So that's something that we can go into much deeper in another conversation, but it's just interesting to note the importance of what we're considering as we're reevaluating our zoning plan. Again, it's required by the state, and it typically contains these standard uses of what types of uses are allowed, what intensity there is, and the site standards and the impact through setbacks or required open spaces, parking, and transitions. So moving on to a different type of zoning is form-based code zoning. So we have our own example here in Petaluma, the Smart Rail station area TOD master plan. So basically form-based code is this idea of more defining what the form of development is going to be. So this really supports the development of mixed use communities. So instead of dividing different uses of lots, it's saying, okay, well, these can fit if they follow certain regulations on what they look like. So this can, it's a tool that planners are using more and more to really, support mixed use developments. And if we compare these across, thinking about, conventional zoning versus form-based code, it's really about kind of like how we go from, this specific divisions of like, okay, you can live here, but you can only work here, to really thinking about how we provide more mixed uses through building lines, through the numbers of floors, through the percentage of built site and frontage to support different uses. And it's just as we were saying before, zoning is one of the essential parts of how we build and guide the future of our city. As Christina said, it's really the teeth, but it's also decisions that we make as decision makers and residents who are participating in these processes.
Right, so the general plan generally sets up these land uses. General plan land uses can result in not very many usually, but 1 or 2 specific zones. So a general plan land use could result in like residential R1 and R2, which are 2 sort of similar residential densities. And this is really the legal use that one is allowed, often with approval by the city, given your particular project, to have on an area of land. And the zoning code is more than that use assignment, that very specific, what you're allowed to have in this area. It also includes, as David was mentioning, a lot of policy around parking ratios, building heights. There can be design guidelines or design requirements, which we're actually working on in tandem with all of this other work. And so, okay, so I'm going to go into specific plans and area plans. We're working from the general, literally the general plan, to more specific plans. Specific plans are a very popular tool. We actually have the central Petaluma specific plan, and then we have this smart station area master plan layered over that. These are essentially more detailed land use and design plans that very in a fine-grained way govern the design of streets, of paths, of buildings, etc. Something that has more detail in it than a general plan. Often these plans will change some land use regulations and will require CEQA. But again, it's a more detailed way of governing land use, and they're often done for downtowns, that kind of thing. There are these 5 basic requirements for a specific plan. Again, specific plans do need to be in compliance with the general plan. And that's one of the ways that the general plan ensures particular actions is through this rule for compliance of all of the different plans underneath it. We also have tools in our planning tool chest of precise plans. So for example, if you set up a framework in the general plan and the land use for the general plan that says we're going to have significantly denser development in downtown San Rafael, and you cover that with CEQA for the general plan, you can then do a precise plan, which details that vision a little bit more. Or in some cases, if it's really a vision plan, it comes before and it doesn't trigger development directly. And so you don't need to go through CEQA for that particular case. There are also other kinds of planning tools which are not geographically based in our planning toolbox. A few of these that we have in Petaluma are listed here, but they can be, a river master plan or something around economic development, or parks, where we're really just detailing out the implementation of the general plan direction. It is also possible to make some changes to the general plan. You're allowed to do 4 of them a year. So it's not an easy process to go through, but that's something that we can talk about a little bit more if people want to know about that. Thinking even more about implementation, even more specifically about implementation, these are some of the tools that we've been mentioning, a zoning code. And then, fundamentally, in order to take particular action, the city has to put it into its working plan. So that can include prioritization work. The city just recently updated our citywide goals and priorities and looked at how different departments are going to be prioritizing work over the next couple of years. That work also needs to be prioritized in the budget, because it is possible to have an unfunded mandate. Just like at national and state levels, you can have that at a city level. The general plan can say we want to have a staffing level of X in a particular department. And if it's just not possible from a funding perspective, then that might not happen. We also, as David mentioned, need to have staff to do it. And then sometimes we need more planning to say, well, what are we going to do on Monday? How are we really going to make this happen? One of the things that the planning department does to really make the rubber hit the road here is to facilitate the development review process. So again, we take the general plan, we have specific plans that give us more information or just zoning. And then this is covering for me. And then if a property owner is interested in changing the use or doing some development on their site, they can submit the development application, which staff will then review, which goes through the public hearing process, and then the project is approved or denied based on either a ministerial review process that doesn't necessarily require public hearings, or based on the conditions of approval or denial that are set forth by our decision makers. We can talk a little bit more about that if you all have questions about that. So we wanted to help think about, what does this mean? How do we get to that bike lane? And that's actually the next slide. But there are a lot of different ways that a city can work on a particular issue. So in this case, we have climate. There are so many different actions that we can take that are relative to climate. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what those different ways are that we, as long-range planners, and then as direct policy planners, and even short, even current planners are thinking about this work. So in the general plan, it is possible to have climate-related policies in nearly every element of the general plan. Land use, if you put denser development here or there, that has climate implications. Transportation obviously has climate implications. Even parks and rec, if you put a park in a neighborhood, that might suggest that folks will travel less because they won't need to travel as much, not as much soccer momming. And we're also going to be doing really specific climate work through, we're building off the climate action framework that the city has developed recently. And we're going to be developing a climate action adaptation plan, which will get more detailed than the general plan would otherwise. That includes a lot of modeling and climate specific policies that will then also need to be implemented. When we think about how do we granularly think about climate, how do we react to the climate emergency that we have declared and are facing in Petaluma, there are quite a range of ways that we can do that. And for example, some current work that the city has been doing has included a gas station ban, the approval and ongoing implementation of an all-electric code for new buildings. We can change our building code so that we are requiring more climate-friendly construction. And the city has an ongoing vehicle miles traveled threshold set of work that we're doing also to try to manage the amount of cars on the road, the number of miles folks are traveling from new development. And we're happy to talk more about that. Again, a lot of these questions came up when we were talking about Sharon, but we don't want to talk for too long. So we're getting near the end. Thinking about an apartment building, how does that get built? The same is true of a house or a factory. We set that framework in the general plan that gets pushed into zoning. The zoning articulates certain standards for what can go where. And then somebody needs to decide that it's a good idea to build what we have outlined, or in some cases say, hey, actually, can you allow like a slightly different use? And that's a whole different, more complicated process where you have to go back through and think about changing the zoning or land use. The developer can be a public entity, so it could be that the city of Petaluma decides to do an affordable housing development, or it could be a private property owner. And then that project has to go through our project review and approval process with our current planners. And then eventually you get to construction. If you want a bike lane, the process is similar. The general plan can give you a framework saying we want multimodal connections. Here are some good places we think that should go. The PED bike plan, which we're working on updating, also can be more specific about the design of those bike lanes and locations and connections and that kind of thing. And then that work has to get funded. So we have to have the money to do the striping or build a cycle track or whatever it is. And then it's also possible that this is a 20-year plan, and so new issues come up. So it's possible that there could be ad hoc programs that kind of come up from committees, commissions, or council that are very compelling, and they do need to be in compliance with the general plan, but the general plan, again, is kind of holding a larger vision. And so that kind of project can go forward without being identified in the general plan. And that could be like the Slow Streets program that we saw during COVID. Some of these are temporary, some of them are longer lasting. Okay, I'm going to whiz through this. This is the other things that we're doing right now, just because I know a lot of folks are interested in these efforts as well. To kick off the general plan process, we convened a ULI technical advisory panel, and they helped us think about how housing could be located in the city, given the fact that we don't necessarily want to go beyond the urban growth boundary. How do we think about infill development on the sites that we have? That report is available on the Petaluma general plan website. The city is in the process of updating the ped and bike plan in tandem with the general plan, first prioritizing some of the projects from the existing plan, and then making sure that that fits in with the new land uses that are going to be identified in the general plan. We recently, council recently-ish, I think it's maybe been 6 months now, adopted this climate emergency framework that is really going to be informing our work and policy work in the general plan, and the development of this climate action and adaptation plan. So we're going to be establishing greenhouse gas reduction targets more specifically through particular sectors, building off of the desire to be climate neutral within the next few years. And I think it's 2035. Heather can yell at me. It really, we're working on community resilience to anticipated impacts of climate change, as well as reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The planning department and, in fact, the planning team that's working on the general plan are going to be helping to facilitate a conversation around the role of the fairgrounds in the city over the next decades. So more news about that will be coming shortly. And we have ongoing work on thinking about how to, again, constrain the greenhouse gas emissions and vehicle miles traveled from new projects. We've set a very aggressive target for that. That's 6.8% below the citywide average, which is more stringent than the state recommended 15%. We also have a recently updated hazard mitigation plan, which is going to inform our safety element. So David is going to take us through, I see that we have 70 chat comments. So Dan, you have your work cut out for you.
Great. Well,
just a couple more slides.
Well, again, just to keep you all posted, the Plan Petaluma site, especially the Get Involved tab, is a great place to go. I'm constantly updating that with the rest of our team. So yeah, we're working on it. The timeline. So, big picture, we're working on this over the next, 4 years to come through 2025. Working on the general plan. Right now, we're working on the general plan and housing element for the first year, and then taking that on to zoning next year, and then finishing the general plan zoning code in 2023. Yes, it is a ways off, but that's how long and complex that this takes. And then focusing on topic specific planning and working on the urban growth boundary, depending on what comes out of this process.
Yes, the urban growth boundary expires in 2025, so we need to accept either preempt that or set the stage for that process.
Mm-hmm. And this is a big picture that you can review in more detail, but just to show the diverse and extensive engagement opportunities and research processes that are going on. In the end, there's a lot of people working on this.
Yeah, and right now we're kind of in between this vision and discovery phase. So we're about to go to a bunch of boards and commissions with existing conditions reports. And towards the end of September, we're going to be having, actually, I'm not going to keep going. David will tell you about what's happening soon.
Great. Well, we really look forward to meeting you all in person. And one safe way of doing that is at community pop-ups. I met a couple of you all at these, and it's been really wonderful. The next one is this week on Thursday on the 9th at the Petaluma Night Market. Also this Saturday, September 11th, Walnut Park Farmers Market. We have the GPAC meeting on September 16th. And then a community visioning workshop that is very, very important. We really hope to see all of you there with us. And we'll also be doing a committee and commission meetings to review the ECRs that Christina mentioned. Just a quick note on our engagement approach. We really want to consider how we integrate more of these educational forums, working with Know Before You Grow, working with other organizations, really meeting people where they are in the community and working with different community groups. So please continue to be in touch with us. And we're also really looking forward to specific communities like youth, children and youth. In the end, we're planning the city that they're inheriting. So it's really important that we get their input in the process. And also thinking about opportunities for the Latinx and Spanish speaking communities in Petaluma to also participate. So whether it's a pop-up or translation, the support that we have from Martin on this call or other Spanish language engagement.
Right. Thanks, David. So you are welcome. If that brought up any questions for anyone, we are happy to work on answering some of them. And the question stands, and I believe that Know Before You Grow is going to be sending out a survey on this of, what do you want to hear about more? So I'm going to turn it over to Dan, who has been tracking all the comments and kind of let us know what we should be tackling next.
So yeah, we have had a whole bunch of comments here, and we'll run through them and then get to specifics. We started out with Tom asking to hear a little bit more about what the mechanisms for recourse are if the city council isn't following the general plan, and how the general plan restricts the council and staff in what they can do.
Yes, so you have a lot of power at the ballot box to elect city council members who you believe will represent the interests that you hold dear. It's also possible to bring lawsuits against the city. But the idea is that we're all sort of working towards the common good. And so, coming to city council or chatting with city council members is a big way to be involved. Heather, you're off mute, so I'm going to let you say some words.
Yeah, I mean, I would start with that many of these projects are a public process. So it's encouraged for people to be involved in that public process, to provide your comments, whether that's written or as part of public comment. There are a lot of nuances to the general plan as well. There may be some things that a project is meeting exactly and some that there may be interpretation around. And so that's some of what goes into the consideration by our decision makers, whether it's our planning commission, whether it is our city council. So that's part of what goes into that, and that's why there is a public process, so that your decision makers can hear the concerns of the community in making those decisions.
John asks, can natural resources be included as well as open space? And I would expand that out to ask, how are the open spaces and parks referred to within the plan? Are these specific plans regions of Petaluma needing more resources? How does that work?
So there is a conservation element of the general plan where we will be focusing on those issues.
Okay. And in the existing general plan, some of those were kind of split up amongst different elements. So you have your natural environment was an element in the current general plan, as well as the parks, recreation, music, and arts, I think is one of the other elements. So you have, open space is talked about in terms of open space for use by the community more in the Parks and Recs chapter. And, biology, natural resources was talked about more in the natural environment chapter of the current general plan. But there's some flexibility on how exactly we structure that in the new general plan. There's not one way. Different communities do it different ways.
Cool. Sharon Kirk asks, what does environmental justice incorporate?
Yes, that's a great question, because if you separate the terms, it can be a little confusing. So we think of the environment, we think of, again, natural resources, et cetera. And justice can be social justice and that kind of thing. And when we put together the term, it is a wonky term that is something that's coming from the state, but really the environmental justice element of the general plan is focused on how does the physical structure of the city, how does your neighborhood or place that you work impact your health and your access to opportunity. So that's what we mean when we talk about environmental justice. It doesn't mean that the city is not working on social justice or environmental preservation, but that's when we put those two words together, that's specifically what we're talking about.
So would tree equity fall into environmental justice?
Tree equity? No,
Yeah.
that would be in conservation.
Well, but I believe, and I'm thinking back on the presentation that the EIR consultant gave to the GPAC on environmental justice. And I believe there was some aspects of it that talked about things that are kind of related to like tree canopy. Are there areas that are hotter in the city because there is not tree canopy? So it also can be seen through that lens if there's an environmental justice impact associated with it.
Certainly, yes. If we think about heat island effects and how trees play into that, and then how that impacts people's health, that's certainly something we could look at in the environmental justice element. There are lots of ways that trees impact our health, actually, psychologically and physically.
Sharon again asked, does the general plan update process include a look back to see at what we have accomplished or where we fell down on implementation? And there were a couple of additional comments from Joy Robinson, for example, asking about riverfront access. What's happened with the riverfront trail that is in various plans, and how do we make sure that gets implemented going forward?
Great question. So yes, part of the work that we're doing right now is to look at our existing conditions. So that includes looking back at the current general plan and thinking about how that was or wasn't implemented and for what reasons. Heather, do you want to add anything about the river plan? I know this comes up.
So for instance, the pathways along the river that are shown in the existing general plan. So a key way that those are implemented in the current structure of things is when a project develops, it would be a requirement for them to install their segment of the river path. So for instance, you see, I think it's the McNear project on Petaluma Boulevard South. They have a path along the river, but it's only for the frontage on their property, but that's in place. And then, for instance, the PEP housing project that's in that same area, they are building their frontage, a path along their frontage along the river. So it gets added to incrementally. The idea is over the long term, all of those pieces will come together and they will be a contiguous path along the river. But in the short term, you get these segments of it, or you have sections of path that are approved, but the project didn't get built. So that's how that is incrementally being realized along the river in Petaluma.
So a
Heather,
lot of that is that we haven't had, for instance, the things along First Street there, all the warehouse buildings, there's been no development there. So we haven't been able to put any restrictions on developers about doing things.
That's correct. And the area, for instance, the area where the, and I'm gonna forget the name, but the apartments that are on kind of at D and First Street that are
Yes.
built, there is a path along the river there.
I walk that regularly, yeah.
Yeah, but then you'll come to an area that stops and you don't have that pathway through. So that's incrementally how we get those pieces, with the idea that eventually it will be a cohesive path along our river and creeks, like it's called for in the general plan.
Right, and so there are some, just to add to that really quickly, there are some limits on the city's power. So the city cannot, we are not going to say, now you must, private property owner, provide public access across your property. So we cannot force the implementation of that trail getting built.
Well, we can when they develop their property.
Unless
And that's when it's added, yeah. But we can't, separate from the development on it is not, we can't go in and have it installed just for that. But when someone comes in with a development proposal, a housing project, whatever kind of private development, that's when we say, oh, well, there's supposed to be a path along this frontage here as shown in our general plan. So you need to show that and incorporate that into your project.
Cool. So Natasha Juliana asks, does the safety element include sea level rise? And Tom added with that, do you have information on the financial risks and consequences of Petaluma allowing development in known floodplains?
We are going to be looking at sea level rise as part of the general plan process. That's something that we are thinking about in the existing conditions phase. And then we'll also be thinking about, as we're thinking about potential land uses throughout the city, sea level rise and flooding. So water coming from either direction up and down the river are going to be elements that we look at. In terms of the financial ramifications, we are going to be working on some implementation analysis for the costs of some of the infrastructure that is going to be proposed in the general plan. And then we're also looking at, we have a market study, so we're doing more economic development that way. We can't analyze absolutely everything, but it's a topic that we're covering in general.
I would add to that, just from the get-go, when the request for proposal for the general plan update was drafted, it identified the issue of development in the floodplain and as a key community interest in undertaking this update, to look at community priorities and better match the general plan and the associated regulations for implementing the general plan with the community conversation about floodplains. So we anticipate and have from the beginning that this will be a real key topic for this general plan update.
Let's see. So where was I on my list here? Sorry, one that should, if I was paying attention, I would have reordered some of these questions to catch all the topics in the same place. Sharon again asked, do metrics exist for assessing environmental justice performance?
We did assessing environmental justice performance. So there are a lot of words there. I'm going to do my best.
How do we know we're doing it? What are
How do we know that we're doing it?
Yeah. What are the measures for, confirmation that we made progress?
I think some of that is going to be through this process too, identifying. So that's a key point of the general plan, is to not only set the policy and set the, the vision and the policy, but identifying implementation so that we can make sure that that vision is realized and we have the mechanisms to see that forward. So to track that, that's one of the things we're looking at a lot with greenhouse gas emissions is, we have a a very strong target of carbon neutrality by 2030, and we need to have quantitative ways to be measuring that. So those are the things that we're going to need to look at closely with environmental justice, greenhouse gas emissions, that type of stuff with this effort.
So it sounds like the state hasn't necessarily defined that on our behalf. It's something that we define.
Well, yeah,
falls out of
yes,
our
and
implementation.
so I was just gonna kind of try to go into the framework a little bit. So what Heather's saying is completely correct. We can establish our own metrics, not only for the performance of this element of the general plan, but for the performance of the other elements of the general plan. There is an established methodology for identifying communities that are disadvantaged or of equity focus. And that includes looking at pollution exposure, looking at health outcomes. So there's a tool and a data set that the state puts out and updates fairly regularly called Cal EnviroScreen. And so we can track that data that the state is gathering also to see how those different communities are performing. So there are also, in addition to whatever metrics we establish to track our success, these statewide metrics that we can continue to monitor.
Thank you. So I would, there's been a lot of great comments. I've been kind of monitoring the chat while listening to the presentation. And I just want to remind everyone that this was intended to kind of level set us on the planning process, or the process we go through to update the general plan and what all the elements are and the tools that we have for implementation. It's not intended to be a feedback on what we haven't done necessarily. So I just want to put that out there, that we're just trying to level set to get everybody to a common framework so we can move forward into more specific discussions.
Thanks. And then we also had a couple of comments about that apparently there are some sections which address noise pollution, but we had a couple of comments about light pollution. Are there places where we can address that in the general plan or in specific plans?
Yes, we can do anything. In general, yes. I mean, so as you kind of saw, there are required elements of the general plan, and there are optional elements of the general plan. It could be that we decide to set some community-wide guidelines or overarching policies around light pollution. It also can be the case that we, in our design standards and guidelines, adopt specific technical requirements around light pollution in particular areas or adjacent to particular uses. And that's something that we are looking at as part of our objective design standards development that we're also undertaking.
I think also, light pollution can kind of fall under different areas of the general plan. You could be talking about it from a community character perspective. You could be talking about it from, a species perspective. I know we looked a lot at light pollution with the floating docks in the turning basin to make sure that any kind of lights on the floating docks don't negatively impact the aquatic life. So I think that light pollution can kind of go into different areas of the general plan too. So it definitely could be a priority that could find policies depending on kind of the direction you're looking at it.
And we got into a lot of specifics, which I don't think are necessarily for this talk. They're good things to bring up at the pop-up events or other kind of the other more specific general plan discussion areas. But we did have Veronica ask, where does community vision fit in here? And I think it fits into the whole thing. That is what this document is supposed to reflect. Is
And
that
it
right?
is a lot of what we're doing right now with the pop-ups, talking in the quadrant meetings that we just had, a large visioning workshop that is coming together for the end of the month. So there, that vision and those like guiding principles, and GPAC discussed those at their, I think it was their last meeting. So it's not necessarily the focus tonight, but it is definitely ongoing. And, you know, Veronica talking about different things that have come up in the other meetings, you know, more pop-ups, a visioning board downtown, you know, so even though those comments are coming in at a meeting like this, we're still noting them and talking about them, and
Yeah,
looking
and this,
forward to more input.
this is work that we're going to keep doing. You know, we have for a year now been kind of asking, what should we be doing with the general plan? What are the big topics that we want to focus on? You know, and then that helped shape the request for proposal that helped us bring in these consultants and give us their charge. Then we've been having these more open-ended sessions, community sessions that Heather mentioned. Now we're going to be coming back and saying, okay, so we have all this data around existing conditions. We have all of this broad level input that folks have been giving us. When we put all this together, like, how does that refine our collective vision? And then we're going to come back with alternatives. You know, like, these are different ways that we could manifest this. You know, what is our selected alternative? What is our community vision? How do we keep narrowing that down? So it's really a question that we keep coming back to over and over with more and more refinement.
I assume there's an engagement process to reflect that refinement, or to discuss that refinement.
Yes, that's all our general plan outreach.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, we've been going for an hour and 12 minutes, and I've been going for a little bit longer because of franticness beforehand. And I think we've, in the chat, we have gotten to, we've kind of gotten into specifics rather than general process things. And obviously that's all being taken into account. And I will also tag the chat along in the comments to the video when I upload the video. And I got a question earlier about making sure that we include the slides, if you're willing to share those.
Sure, yes, of course.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Can I share a quick link for everyone? I'd love to get some feedback on what folks would like to learn more about. Dan, Dave, and I are standing by to receive your inputs. So if I can go ahead and share, Dan.
I believe you should be able to.
Okay, great.
Try it, see what breaks.
Okay. So this is just really quickly, this is our, you can find our survey at urbanchat.org/feedback. So you'll see this, the surveys listed there. Oh, look at that. I'm showing this over and over. And then if you have feedback in an area that wasn't discussed today, you can also send an email directly to feedback@urbanchat.org. There was great content here, not all of which is captured in the survey. So we certainly want to hear what it is you'd like to focus on in future forums. And I'm not you know, having planning on the hook for all of those, but we would like to hear what you're most interested in. Thank you.
Wonderful. And yes, Joy will hopefully be getting in touch with me, and we'll see what we can talk about in terms of light pollution. Wonderful. Anything further? Thank you, Heather.
And can I add one thing? Just there, I noticed a lot of comments about housing in the comments, and I just kind of want to. It's a big topic, obviously. So we could go on and on, but I just wanted to kind of set a few. I feel like I would be remiss without making a few comments on it. So we are required by the state, and our numbers are not final, but it is looking, as Christina showed on a slide, it's looking very likely that what our regional housing needs allocation for the 8-year planning period for our housing element will be 1,910 units. So that's almost 3 times the number of units we were allocated or given by the state in our last housing element. So while the city doesn't have to build those, we have to show that that number of units could be built. So that means identifying the site, making sure they have the general plan, land use, and the zoning in place. We have to show that we're not creating barriers, that we are supporting, have things in place to support that. What we can do is we can look at where we want to focus that. So we can, identify areas downtown as much as we already have in the current general plan, where we say right downtown, there's no max on density and it's near the train station. And so we've done some of that already. And I would anticipate that we will do some of that again to try to focus our housing development in those areas and to not grow out, because we do have our urban growth boundary, and that is very important to the community. So the thing about market rate versus affordable is we have to show, when we get to our regional housing needs allocations, we have to show that we're hitting them at the different income levels that are prescribed. The way the city's inclusionary housing, the way we get affordable housing, is as a percentage, requiring a percentage of a market rate project. So we don't have, the city doesn't have the legal authority to say you can only build if it's low income. We have lots of ways to incentivize, and we do that through some of our processes to try to incentivize low income housing, because that is the area that we have more difficulty meeting our regional housing numbers. But the city requires 15% of the number of market rate units to be affordable. So in order to hit our low income, our very low income, even our moderate, we have to have enough market rate to pay for those. So I just kind of want to,
So even though the RENA numbers have fairly small numbers in the above market rate, if we don't let those units get built, there's no way to fund the below market rate or moderate income units getting built.
I'm not saying there's no way
harder
to fund it. It's just the way we're currently set up. That's the way it's currently set up. So we'll be looking for different ways to incentivize that, to come up with that. But when redevelopment was eliminated, that's where a lot of the city's income came from to put money towards affordable housing. We don't have that income source anymore. So we're constantly looking for new sources of income, looking at, like we just did with the Danco group in terms of partnering on a loan and grant money for the Meridian at Corona Station project, which is fully affordable. So we're constantly looking for ways we can do that and leverage money in different ways. But I just wanted members of the public to get a little bit of a sense of, under the way we have it structured right now, the number of affordable units we can require is a percentage of the market rate units that are built.
Yes, and there are some, just like Heather's saying, there are some 100% affordable housing projects, but you kind of have to either figure out how to finance those affordable housing projects or figure out how to pay for those units using inclusionary zoning. So, either you're sort of compensating for those affordable units with market rate units, or you're ending up with a funding shortfall because it costs $500,000 to build an affordable unit, and that money has to come from somewhere. It's not fully funded by the state. The city has limited access to funds. So we're sort of we're trying to figure out how to close that gap for these other kinds of projects where we get more affordable units.
So that would be where organizations like PEP and their current development on the Boulevard South and Mid-Penn come in, because they can find other funding sources.
Right, and they're looking to the city to help participate. So for instance, with the Mid-Penn project, the city did have some in lieu funds, and the council approved allocating some of those funds to Mid-Penn, and then Mid-Penn can use those funds to leverage it for other funds. So we definitely have, and I mean, in Petaluma right now, we have PEP, which is under construction. We have an approved Burbank project. We have an approved Mid-Penn housing project, and we have the Danko project. So we have, approved affordable, 100% affordable housing projects by a number of different affordable housing providers right now.
Okay, yeah, and that also means that it's not as dire a situation as divide the number of affordable housings by projects by 0.15 and say we got to build that many luxury units.
No, there's other ways. I just wanted to put a little bit of a light there that it's not, it's not an option to say we only build affordable units. I think with the housing, we have to be constantly looking for every possible creative, flexible. We have to be agile. We have to be ready to that's great. Let's do that. Let's, work with this group. Let's explore that. Let's do this. Let's do that. We are bringing forward a emergency declaration for the shelter crisis to try to allow us to be more agile with coming up with solutions to our housing crisis for those that are experiencing homelessness. So there's not one answer when it comes to the housing crisis. We need, as a community, I think we really need to be open and agile to respond to the opportunities that come up.
Yeah, and like Heather said, we could talk about this all night.
Yeah, sorry.
No, and it's fantastic. I'm going to add. There actually was a really great presentation, and we can try to send out a link on affordable housing and affordable housing finance that the planning team put together for City Council, so we can kind of share that for folks who want to do a little deeper dive. But like Heather was saying, what all of this means when the rubber hits the road for the housing element is that, yes, we have to plan for that regional housing needs assignment allocation and a bit more, because we have to account for those market rate units, and because we need to have, the state's going to require 25 to 30% buffer in terms of that unit count, because we need to maintain that capacity for all the affordable units, and they don't all, we can't say, no, you have to build more units over here, or, it has to be 50%. We can't require that for all the projects. So we have to have some wiggle room in the sites that we identify.
Wonderful.
If I could add just one quick comment, we do have an upcoming forum through Know Before You Grow on affordable housing. I think it's going to be January sometime. The person organizing that is the regional manager of Mid-Penn Housing. So that'll be one night we talk about nothing but this topic.
Fantastic.
So I was just kind of priming it.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, I think my brain is full. Thank you very, very much. I got a lot out of this, and also trying to keep up with all of the comments in the chat. I think I've got some things that I want to try to figure out how we fit into various upcoming forums. And I see Dave nodding there. And I also saw, I'm switching my views around, and I hope it doesn't muck up the recording too much, but I saw a lot of nodding and excited faces when Christina, you mentioned the presentation put together by your books. So yes, we would love to figure out how to get that out to everybody.
Okay.
With that, I thank everybody for coming. Anybody have any final notes before we close off?
Just wanted to thank David, Christina, and Heather for answering questions and for a fine presentation. It's just been a whirlwind. I think Derek said we don't quite have a master's, but we may have a bachelor's, so we're on our way.
And thanks to Martine also.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, and thanks to Dan for setting up the interpretation under duress.
Yes, and we do appreciate you hosting us.
And so
Definitely.
the other
Alright.
thing is, because I spent the $80 for the interpretation right beforehand, this means we've got a 500 attendee limit for the next month. So everybody, tell your friends, we want to max this sucker out.
Yeah.
Well, and to be honest, the speaker we have for the next forum is a pretty incredible speaker. He's a nationally known sustainable urbanist, Doug Farr. I've heard him speak several times. He's marvelous. We truly should get a lot of people there that night. Please join us.
Wonderful. And with that, thank you all and have a wonderful
evening.
evening. And everybody I've told to email me. Thanks.
Thanks
Bye.
all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.